Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV. Want to welcome everyone into our live show, and we're going to break down some of the most important issues in policing. We got some really interesting cases this week, and we're going to get into it here in a few. Again, just want to welcome everyone in. Looks like we have some people in here, a couple people from Texas and Australia. So wow, and Virginia as well. Sonia Salinas, hi. Hey, how's it going? It's good to see everybody in here, and kind of like we do all the time while we're going through the show and I'm talking about these cases. If you have some information or you think differently than I do on something, make sure you put it in the chat. One of my favorite things to do as we're going through these cases is to have a discussion, to go back and forth and really exchange ideas on some of these interesting topics. So just in case you haven't before, please make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel, Cops and Cons TV. If you want to go ahead and follow me, Daniel, you can do that over at Police Law News, over at Twitter, YouTube, Substack, all those other channels. Oh, we've got someone... Pork Zombie Puke is from Seattle, and Jeff is from Arizona. Steve Ladner, good afternoon, Steve. All right, so we're going to get right into it. So the first case that I want to talk about, this happened on March 1st, so just a couple days ago, in Farmington, Utah. So this was a case, it was an officer-involved shooting, and this started with a traffic stop. So Farmington, Utah police officers initiated a traffic stop on a vehicle, and the reason for the traffic stop was because the vehicle wasn't registered. So a lot of times I talk about lawful objective. So what was the reason that the police officers came into contact with that individual? If there's no lawful reason, if there's no reasonable suspicion or probable cause, and then later on there's a use of force or an officer-involved shooting, I'm really hard on police officers if there's no good reason to make contact in the first place. When it comes to search and seizure, I'm a real stickler for that kind of stuff. But this is a case where the initial contact seemed to be reasonable because the vehicle wasn't registered. So the police officer made a traffic stop. Well, he made a traffic stop and he contacted the driver, whose name is Chase Allen. Chase Allen is 25 years old, and unfortunately, he's a sovereign citizen. So during this whole interaction, he plays the same games that sovereign citizens play every single time. And this entire interaction between Chase Allen and the police officer is all captured on body camera footage, and I've seen a lot of body camera footage of sovereign citizens interacting with police officers, just like a lot of you have, I'm sure. And this police officer, he is unbelievably reasonable and respectful with Chase Allen, and I'm going to go through some of the contact before we get to the officer-involved shooting. So the police officer does exactly what you would expect them to. He asks for the driver's license, registration, insurance card. Almost immediately, Chase Allen says that he doesn't have to give any of those documents to the police officer, and essentially he refuses. So the police officer goes back and forth with him for several minutes. As soon as he notices and that Mr. Allen isn't being cooperative, the officer called for backup. This is the right thing to do because a lot of times police officers are able to use less force if there's more officers there. If someone is going to be combative or if force is going to have to be used, a lot of times 2 or 3 officers may be able to get someone into custody just using empty hand tactics instead of if it's just one officer that might rise to a higher level of force. So the fact that as soon as Mr. Allen said that he wasn't going to cooperate, that the police officer started backup, this is a good thing that the police officer did. So the police officer continues to have contact with him. He waits till backup gets there, and eventually the conversation goes something to the effect of this. The officer says, hey, listen, I'm asking for your driver's license. You are required to give me your identification card because I stopped you for a lawful reason. And this interaction, this can go one of 2 ways. You can cooperate and you can give me your identification. I can continue with my investigation for why the vehicle isn't registered, or you can be uncooperative and we're going to pull you out of the car and you're going to be arrested. So he basically leaves the what's going to happen, he puts it into the hands of Mr. Allen. And most of the time when there's a use of force from police officers, this is the case. The individuals make the decision and the police officers react to that decision. Most of the time it's not very surprising. But what's rare and doesn't always happen is that the police officer was so calm and reasonable that he was able to lay it out for Mr. Allen, where he specifically said, this is what's going to happen, and if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. We can go down either path you want. I would prefer the path of you just handing me your driver's license and we handle this just like a normal traffic stop. But Mr. Allen, because he's a sovereign citizen, he doesn't think the laws apply to him. He's a special. So he doesn't do that. Eventually, it comes to the point where police officers tell him that, if he doesn't get out of the car, if he doesn't give his driver's license, that he's going to be pulled out of the car and arrested. It's at that point the police officers open the door and they they make good on their word. They do exactly what they say they're going to do. Mr. Allen tells the police officers that if they go hands-on with him, if they touch him, that they're going to have a problem. Well, they did have a problem, because as the police officers were forcefully trying to get Mr. Allen out of the vehicle, he did have a holster and he had a gun, and he reached for that gun. As he was reaching for the gun, one of the police officers yells, "Gun, gun, gun," and another police officer fires. Mr. Allen ended up dying. He was 25 years old. And this is a tragic story, because if we look at this, listen, anyone who has had the displeasure to deal with a sovereign citizen knows exactly whose fault this is when it comes to big picture. It's the parents. They radicalized him and they ruined him, and he was a young man. This seems like this is a lawful and reasonable and justified officer-involved shooting, and here's why. It's because Mr. Allen, he was uncooperative with police officers, and then as they tried to take him into custody, he reached for a gun. In that moment, it would be reasonable for a police officer to want to avoid what would happen if Mr. Allen got a hold of that gun and tried to shoot the police officers. So that's my opinion on that story. It's been in the news the last couple of days, national news. Let's see what everybody says about this case. All right, let's see. Daryl Smith says, first thing Chase should have done was tell the officers he had a firearm. Daryl Smith, yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable thing to do, is to tell a police officer that you have a firearm. Of course, Steve Ladner says, immature, trigger-happy cops murdered that kid. So, Steve, I would ask you, what should the police officers have done when Mr. Allen is reaching for a gun? So, again, this is one of those things where it's like, if you're not the one up there, making contact with someone lawfully, trying to arrest them, and, saying, well, the officer should have let him grab the gun. The officer should have let him fire. The officer shouldn't return fire until they're shot 5, 6, 7, or 8 times. That doesn't make sense. That's not reasonable. So, Steve Ladner, if you can point to any training or law that says a police officer has to wait until they're being shot at before they defend themselves, let me know. I'll be curious about that. Let's see. If they, Pork Zombie says, if they aren't actively stopping bad cops, they are complacent. Okay, fine. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Sonia says, there's bad everywhere. If you obey the laws, there will be no problems. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So, most of the time, again, when it comes to officer-involved shootings, it isn't the choice of the police officer. It's the actions of the individual. And the police officers were very clear. I always talk about decision points. It's very easy to have just blanket criticism of police officers that's broad and really isn't specific. And all that does is indicate to the rest of us that you aren't very educated, not just on the overarching topic of policing, but you're not very educated or involved on the specific facts of different cases. What I mean by that is, I went through this case step by step. And if a police officer made a mistake, I would say, okay, this is what happened. This is what the police officer should have done. But in this case, again, tell me where the police officer made a mistake. So it's not like the police officer started to shoot him before he reached for the gun. He reached for a gun while he was not cooperating with arrest, and police officers utilized deadly force. I mean, to me, that seems reasonable. Again, if you could point to any training, policy, or law that would indicate the police officers to do something different, that's the space where I'd like to have a conversation. But a lot of times the criticism is, really just dishonest criticism. When you say the police officers did bad, they are trigger happy, but you don't list anything specific about a case. It's really difficult to take people seriously when you don't give specific criticism on what police officers should do. Steve Ladner says he was taking off his seatbelt. He wasn't taking off his seatbelt. Let's see. Fuck Off says cops always go for their guns first. That's the wrong form of there. But Fuck Off, it's they didn't go for their guns, so I would encourage you to watch the video because they didn't go for their guns first. They actually talked to this individual for several minutes. They gave him multiple times to comply, and they told him that force was going to be used. And instead of using their guns to try to get him out of the car, they used their hands. They were trying to escort him out of the vehicle. It was at that point he reached for a gun. They utilized deadly force, which it is going to be absolutely reasonable. Did they shoot him enough times? Yeah, they shot it just out. Yeah, they shot him enough times so he wasn't a threat. That's exactly what they did. So everybody can go and watch the body camera footage of this. And like I said, if you have a specific criticism of what the police officers do, or again, you can point to training or policy or law that would indicate the police officers to do something different. I'm interested to hear it. Let's have an honest discussion and a debate. Just saying, saying all police officers are bad, all police officers are trigger happy. Not real helpful, I'll be honest. All right, so the next case that Sonia says they don't always go for their guns. Yeah, of course they don't always go for their guns because they didn't in this case. But, facts don't always matter to a lot of people. So the next case that I want to talk about is Katie Sponsler. So this is kind of a strange case. So I'm not sure if everybody has been following it. I did multiple videos on TikTok about this over the past week. So definitely go ahead and follow me over there at Police Law News. And because I've been talking about this case and going back and forth with people all week. So Katie Sponsler, essentially Katie Sponsler, she was in the Air Force. After the Air Force, she went to be a National Park Ranger. And she was a National Park Ranger for a couple years. Now listen, I don't know anything about being a National Park Ranger. The first time I even heard anything kind of specifically about what they do is Dennis from Street Cop Training. He's got really great training, really great podcast. He was with the National Park Ranger with the National Park Service, and he kind of talked about it. And they were actually more proactive, at least in the D.C. area, than I expected them to be. But back to Katie Sponsler. So again, she was in the Air Force for 10 or 11 years. And then she was a National Park Ranger for a couple years. She separated employment with them. She resigned is what's on her website. And the website was because she did run for Congress in 2021 in Virginia. She ran for Congress. She unsuccessfully ran for Congress. And she really hasn't been heard from since, I'll be honest, until like late in January, early in February. I had no idea who she was, but here's kind of how she came into the national spotlight. So on January 28th of 23, she wrote a tweet, and this was right after the Tyree Nichols shooting, which again, Tyree Nichols, death at the hands of Memphis police officers, which again everybody has said is an unlawful killing. That all those 5 officers should absolutely be prosecuted. So Katie Sponsler, she basically wrote a tweet, and her tweet said a couple things, and she talked about her training as a park ranger, a federal park ranger, and she essentially criticized the police training in her tweet. She said 2 things, and I'll get to the specifics of them here in a few, but she criticized a couple things in her police training. She said that one of the things that she thinks needed to change is that she was trained to yell "stop resisting" or "drop the gun" after an officer-involved shooting, and she didn't like that part of the training. She also said that because I was a smaller female, that I was trained that I could use more force more quickly than larger people, and I didn't like that either. Well, that tweet went viral. That tweet got just over, I think, 4.5 million views. So she became a pretty national figure after that. A couple days later, on 1/31, she went on the horrible, awful Joy Reid show on MSNBC, and then she was asked to write an article for Time magazine on 2/6/23. So looking at some of the things that she talked about, that's kind of who she is and why she's in the national spotlight. So I wrote an article, basically what she said on the Joy Reid and in her Time article. I wrote an article kind of as a rebuttal to it over on my Substack over at Police Law Newsletter on Substack. I also went back and forth and I did a couple of videos on TikTok about it. But let me just address a couple of the things she said, because what she said is it's absolutely ridiculous. This criticism of police training is absolutely insane. Here's why. And please tell me in the comments if you think that I'm wrong on this, or you think that the police training should be something different. So the first thing she says is that she was critical of the training that police officers yell "stop resisting" or "drop the gun" after an officer-involved shooting. So I'm going to say it's completely reasonable for police officers to yell that. Now, yelling "stop resisting" or "drop the gun," drop the weapon, now after a use of force, after an officer-involved shooting? No, of course. That is not the only time that police officers should yell those things. Police officers should give very clear commands, just like the officer did in the first case that we talked about. But police officers should give very clear commands to individuals, if possible, if feasible, before use of force, before an officer-involved shooting. They should also do it after an officer-involved shooting, and here's why. So let's say there's an officer-involved shooting where someone is armed with a gun. So once an officer shoots someone, they are going to be injured. Almost immediately, the what should shift in the police officer's mind is to how do we get this person medical help? Firefighters, emergency medical service, how do we get this person who's shot, how do we get them help as quickly as possible? So if an individual is still armed with a gun or reaching for a gun or still holding on to a gun, that's not a safe situation, and essentially firefighters, paramedics, EMS, they're not going to come into the scene until the scene is safe. Also, if an individual just threatened a police officer with a gun and the police officer had to shoot the individual because of that, it's reasonable for the police officer to not want to have to injure the person more, right? So that makes complete sense. So giving commands of drop the gun, stop resisting, drop the weapon after an officer-involved shooting, just to tell people, like, hey, stop doing that, so then the police officers can make the scene safe and get emergency medical personnel on scene as quickly as possible. So that makes complete sense. I don't understand her criticism, because think about it this way. Let's say a police officer didn't yell stop resisting, didn't yell drop the gun, didn't yell drop the weapon, and because the police officer didn't yell that, the individual just kept grabbing at the weapon and, threatened the police officer again, and the police officer had to fire more shots. The first thing that these anti-police activists would say is the officer never told the individual to drop the gun. How is the person supposed to know that they're not supposed to pick up a gun and point it at a police officer unless they're specifically told? And that is a little bit the bigotry of low expectations. But you see where I'm going with this. It's completely reasonable for police officers to give commands after an officer-involved shooting to make sure that the scene is safe, to get paramedics on scene to render aid. It seems like that's a good goal, good training, good policy for a police officer to follow. And again, it's strange to indicate that that's problematic in any way. But please put this in the comments if you think that what she said was reasonable. Let's see, any comments on that one? No comments. So let's see. No comments on that one. So let's talk about the other thing. That Katie Sponsler said. She talked about disparity of force. This is essentially what she said is about disparity of force. And this is what I mean by that. So she criticized the training, where she claims the training was that because she was smaller, that she was justified to use more force quicker than a larger officer. Well, yes, that's absolutely true. That's called disparity of force. And let me talk about some of the things, what that means with disparity of force. That means when there is a disparity, a difference between the offender or someone the police are trying to get into custody and the police officer. Here are some of the factors, though this is not an exhaustive list. Age, sex, height, weight, whether or not the officer or the individual is injured, whether or not they are intoxicated, whether or not they have access to weapons. All of these things are factors when it comes to disparity of force. And I'm going to explain this. I'm going to do a little story time. I'm going to explain this in a way where I'm going to talk about some of the people I graduated the police academy with, and that's the best way for me to kind of put this into perspective. So here are some of the people that I graduated the police officer with. One guy was 6'7", 22 years old, and he weighed over 200 pounds. Another guy was able to bench press over 400 pounds, and he was also an amateur boxer and had won fights all over the country. We also had a female who was 35 years old, 4'11", 100 pounds, had never been in a fight in her life. Just take those three people. Let's say all three of those officers are working on the street and they're attacked by a 200-pound man. Would you expect them to use the same level of force to defend themselves? Of course not. I would expect that my 4'11" friend, I would expect her, in order to try to thwart an attack by a 200-pound man and defend herself, I would expect that she would probably have to utilize a taser or OC spray or maybe even deadly force in order to stop someone from attacking her who's twice her size. Now, my friend who benches 400 pounds, I wouldn't necessarily expect him to go to the taser first thing. My other friend who's 6'7" in really good shape, and I wouldn't expect him either because of his size. So that's what I mean by disparity. Now, if you agree with that, just that basic principle, it's a reasonable principle to teach. It's a reasonable principle to teach police officers. So also in the department that I worked for, we also had an individual who used to play on an NFL team. So again, the difference between him and someone who's 4'11", or even someone who's 5'10", 150 pounds, the difference of force that they might have to use in a different situation, it's reasonable that could be different. Now, that doesn't still make it that force has to be objectively reasonable from a police officer. Of course it does. Force has to be objectively reasonable reasonable. But this whole concept of disparity of force, that is a reasonable concept that is taught, a reasonable principle that is taught to virtually all police officers during use of force training, not only on the local and the state level, but also on the federal level. So the idea that Katie Sponsler is going to criticize this training and say that it's problematic, to me, is absolutely insane. Curious what your thoughts are. Art Vandalay. Let's see. Okay, so I'm not sure what Art's talking about. Let's see. Pork Zombie Pukey, if you get shot pulling a gun on a cop, it was reasonable. Yeah, I agree 100%. Let's see. No other comments on this case. But yeah, so that was just some of the stuff based on Katie Sponsler. So, I just want to say that, essentially there is an entire industry of former law enforcement officers who are given airtime, not for their accomplishments or because they did anything great while they were a police officer, but because they have a willingness to criticize police for anything, despite all of the facts. There's an entire industry of this. This is essentially the anti-police industrial complex. It's one of those things where if you're a former police officer and you're willing, all you have to do to get famous, to get on Joy Reid, is say, hey, I will come on and I will disparage police no matter what they do, no matter what the facts. Have me on, I'll go ahead and do it. That's the easiest way for former police officers with a mediocre career to get famous. I think Katie Sponsler is probably in that group. I did go back and forth. So the article that I wrote on this case, basically doing a rebuttal of the things that she said, both in her Time Magazine article, which I'll get to in a second, and also in the in her interview on Joy Reid, the article that I wrote, I did tag Katie Sponsler on Twitter. We did go back and forth for a while. I eventually stopped the conversation when she refused to go back and forth with me on the things that she actually said and started talking about the health problems of her kids as a reason. So, I'll be honest, it got real strange. But if you don't follow me on Twitter, that's a reason to. So there are definitely strange conversations that happen there. What she said about in her Time Magazine article, this is something I also have a problem with. So what anti-police activists like to do is they like to lump together all different police officer involved shootings. They want to lump them all together. They want to make it so the public can't tell the difference between Tyree Nichols and Breonna Taylor. They want you to see all of these police officer involved shootings, not look at the facts, not look at the evidence. We're going to put them all into the same group. And that's what Katie Sponsler did at the end of her Time Magazine article. She listed in a sentence about talking about problematic police behavior, she listed Tyree Nichols, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, all in the same sentence, which is absolutely insane because one of those three was objectively reasonable. Even the Biden administration, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, who is not necessarily pro-police, even he said this was a lawful, reasonable, justified officer-involved shooting of Breonna Taylor. So to kind of list that in with other cases like George Floyd and Tyree Nichols, which we agree are not lawful actions by police officers, but this is exactly what anti-police activists want, to lump every officer-involved shooting case together, to not have anyone look at the facts. They think that people are too stupid to look at the facts and to just recognize names and say, this is a narrative, this must be true. And they expect people to be lazier than I hope they actually are. Let's see. Here we got some comments. Breezy says, I could not be a police officer. We need the police, my own personal opinion. Of course we need police officers. We know what happens when police officers pull back, that there are all kinds of communities where the violence goes up. All right, the next case that we're going to talk about, and this is Cop City in Atlanta, and I covered this a couple different times, but it's worth talking about again because there were just a whole bunch of arrests over at Cop City in Atlanta. Now, what's Cop City? So Cop City is essentially a state-of-the-art police training center just outside of Atlanta. So this is on land that is owned by the city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta has owned this for approximately 100 years or 85 years or something like that. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to build something called Cops. They didn't call it Cop City. People who don't like it call it Cop City. It's essentially a giant state-of-the-art training program for police, not just for police, but also for fire. It's going to have a simulation, a driving track for police and fire to use, a training facility. It's also going to have like a pretend city, so police officers and firefighters can do different training when it comes to hostage rescue and when it comes to simulating fires and rescuing people. So this is just outside of Atlanta, and not just Atlanta police is going to be able to use it. Seems like this is going to be a complex to be able to be used by Art Vandelay. So the Cop City wasn't the name that the city gave to it. This is people who don't like it. This is what they're doing. James Echo says the whole Atlanta police training facility debacle is crazy. The protesters need to let it go. Atlanta police should fire. The police and fire should have a modern training center. It is because, so think about it this way. Anti-police activists, they keep saying, we want better trained police. We want more educated police. So then the city of Atlanta says, okay, we're going to build this state-of-the-art police training center. And what do? They protest, they riot, they vandalize, and they set fires over there. Because here's the reason. Here's the secret. Anti-police activists do not want better police, more educated police. What they want is to abolish police. So when these anti-police activists, when they criticize police training and police equipment, just remember what they want to replace it with. Nothing. That's their goal, is to abolish police. So what happened this week is there was multiple people, and there's all kinds of video. There's drone footage. There's body camera footage. Multiple people came onto the property of, we'll call it Cop City, even though that's not what the city calls it. That's what the crazy people call it, but I don't have a better name for it. So they all came onto the property of Cop City, and essentially not only were they vandalizing the area, they were setting a whole bunch of fires. All kinds of videos on Twitter and YouTube. You can see of all these fires that they're setting all over the place. They're setting machinery on fire. It's absolutely crazy. So police officers went in, they arrested 23 people. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Not just that 23 people were arrested. What's interesting is that only a handful of the 23, I think 4 of the people, were actually from Atlanta, and less than 10 were from Georgia. So essentially, about 60% of the individuals who were arrested weren't even from Georgia, not even from the immediate area. So essentially, this is an excuse for maniacs from all over the country to riot. That's what this is. It's absolutely disgusting behavior. And again, you can't claim that you want better police, better trained police, where there are incidents where the training is going to help. So there's less incidents of officer-involved shootings. That's what my goal is. That's what I want. I want there to be less violence between citizens and police. That is my overarching goal with all of this. But that isn't the goal of the anti-police activists. Otherwise, they would want police to have a good training center. So this is part of the defund the police movement, and it's absolutely insane. James Echo says destabilization. James, that is 100% correct. This is what they want. These anti-police activists, they want to defund police and destabilize communities. This is their goal. All right, let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. Breezy B says, let them do their jobs. There'll be no issues. Comply and buy. Yeah, that's 100% correct. And, Breezy, just what I want to say, and I say this all the time, that if you are wronged by a police officer, if they arrest you for something that you didn't do, there are avenues to fight back. There are avenues to challenge that. And people should absolutely use those avenues. You can file a complaint with the police department. If your rights actually were violated, you will have a line of about 100 attorneys lining up to represent you in a case, because this is easy money for attorneys. So, and I mean, if it's a bullshit case and your rights really weren't violated, you're right. You're probably not going to have a whole lot of attorneys interested in helping you out because there's no money at the end. But if you truly had your rights violated, there are 100 attorneys who are going to be fighting each other in order to take your case. So, and if your rights were violated by a police officer, that is 100% absolutely what you should do. What you shouldn't do is fight with a police officer on the street where either the officer could get injured or you could get killed. That seems like the most insane thing for anyone to advocate for. Let's see. Any other questions on that case? Yeah, so that's the Cop City case. And again, listen, it's going to take them a couple years to build this thing. And so this is just going to keep happening. There's going to be more interaction between citizens and police. So I don't know if they need to build a wall around it or what, but it's absolutely crazy. DG416, I see my old patch hang in there. Yes, we have a whole bunch of patches. Thank you so much. Let's see. Stephen, I file a complaint for them to laugh in your face. Okay. I mean, it depends. So if you file a complaint and they laugh in your face, you should record the interaction, put it on YouTube, and you'll be able to make your money back there. So why don't you go ahead and do that? Let's see. Pork Zombie says they arrested people at a concert a mile away. Let the locals go and only arrested out-of-state people. Okay, I'm not sure what that is in reference to. When police officers arrest mass groups of people, I don't know if they automatically know exactly who's from where. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But let's talk about soft on crime policies, because really this is one of those things that is overarching when it comes to policing and safety in cities. You know, what the policies are like that actually matters, because bad public policy has predictable results. So we're going to go back to San Francisco for a little bit. So if you remember, what San Francisco did is they did two things. It was a combination of bad law and bad police policy. So city of San Francisco, so the state of California a couple years ago, what they did is they made it anything, in order for a shoplifting to be a felony, it had to be over $1,000. So essentially anything under $1,000 in the state of California was considered a misdemeanor. And so most of the time when you shoplift, especially from places like, Walgreens and stores like gas stations, it's not going to be over $1,000. So that was the state law. Anything over $1,000, that's where the line is with a felony. Then the city of San Francisco came in and they basically added terrible policy onto that terrible law. What the city of San Francisco did is they basically said that police officers are not allowed to arrest for misdemeanor, so they can only issue tickets. So what that did is that made it so that people were able to steal from all kinds of stores, and as long as it was under $1,000, they knew that there was no chance they were going to go to jail. Now listen, I'm not saying that anyone who steals a pack of Jolly Ranchers from Walgreens should go to jail every single time. But if you steal $200, $300, $400, $500 from a store, you should at least have in the back of your mind, like, hey, if I get caught, I could go to jail. There's some deterrence in that. But if you know, hey, worst case scenario, if I'm caught by the police, all I'm going to do is get a ticket. No way I can go to jail. What's the incentive to stop? It got so bad in San Francisco that over 20 Walgreens stores closed in San Francisco, and the CEO of Walgreens cited retail theft, and that it just wasn't a viable business option anymore, because they couldn't, not only was the retail theft, but because of this, they couldn't keep their employees and other customers safe. So that's what happened in San Francisco. In the last couple weeks, Walmart has said that is leaving Portland for the same reason: retail theft. Retail theft is so out of control in Portland because of the bad laws and because of the bad policies for the police department, that essentially Walmart is leaving the city of Portland. Now, I know what a lot of people say. A lot of people say, well, what does it matter? Screw Walmart. The community doesn't need Walmart. Well, listen, that's a real privileged thing to say. And the reason is because imagine if you are low income or disabled or elderly, and that's where you get your food, that's where you get your groceries, that's where you get your medicine, and that's the only store that's in walking distance. Yeah, it matters that these stores close. So it's very privileged, and it's what Rob Henderson calls a luxury belief, to be able to think of these things and say, well, who cares if Walmart closes? It doesn't affect me, without actually thinking about the people that it does affect. And I want to talk about this idea of luxury beliefs. So luxury beliefs essentially are ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while often inflicting costs on the lower class. What that means is defund the police. Here's what I mean by that. And the Walmart closing, that's an example of these luxury beliefs. It's basically being able to have these ideas that I don't care if Walmart closes, I don't care, we can go ahead and defund the police. But then, so you can advocate for these policies, for social credit. But if these policies are actually enacted, you're not the ones who's going to suffer the consequence. The people, the rich liberals who are living behind walls and gated security and private security, those aren't the ones who are going to suffer the consequences, because they have the privilege to not live in an area where they're afraid to go to the store after dark. And it's the poor people and lower people on the socioeconomic rung, that's who are going to suffer the consequences. And that's why it is extremely irritating when stores like this close, because there are a lot of people who don't have transportation. This is the only place that they could possibly go. They're the ones who are going to be affected by this. All right, James Echo, San Francisco got a new DA after getting rid of DA Chesa Dwayne, I can never say his name, due to the high retail theft. Yeah, that's 100% correct. Yeah, so not only did San Francisco get a new DA, but also the mayor of San Francisco, can't think of her name, I think it might be London Breed off the top of my head, but the mayor of San Francisco, she ran on a defund the police nonsense in 2021 when she was elected. Very shortly after being elected into office, she basically said that this is nonsense, we have to enforce the law. So we got the mayor who was basically saying we're not going to let the city just be lawless, and the DA was voted out. So again, so when I talk about these bad policies, soft on crime policies, listen, if it's just time to admit that they made a mistake, that they don't work. Listen, if these policies aren't working in San Francisco and Portland, then just admit that they don't work and let's move on. All right, James Echo, in California, some suspects get to walk even if they have a small warrant, like a $5,000 or less. I've seen it happen. James, that's absolutely crazy. That's absolutely nuts that can happen. Let's see. Any other? Are officers, basket case, are officers supposed to shoot if they themselves didn't see the threat? Don't think so. Utah case. Well, I mean, it's so basket case. It's a totality of the circumstances. So typically police officers have to justify every single round that comes out of their gun. So if one police officer yells gun, 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 that has to go into it too. So what you're basically asking for is the other police officers who are there, they see that someone is being uncooperative, that's seeing that someone is resisting arrest. They see another police officer saying that this guy has a gun. So in that case, if you expect a reasonable police officer to not believe their partner, to think that their partner is lying, okay, that'll be interesting. But essentially, it's a totality of the circumstances. Police officers do not have to wait until they are being shot in the face before they return fire. All right, let's see. Any other questions on that case? Okay, so the last case that I want to talk about, and this is kind of a police case, is it's the Tucker Carlson footage that has come out when it comes to January 6th. And really, I just want to ask a question first of all. So why are people mad? Why are people mad at the footage being released by Tucker Carlson? Is it because they're just mad that he's releasing the footage, or are they mad at his opinion of the footage? So I'm curious what people think about that. But, some of this footage coming out, this did bring up, and a lot of people have been talking, and not just on Twitter, but it's been covered on some national stories, that now more of this footage has been coming out. They've been talking more about the Ashley Babbitt case. And listen, I'm not going to say that the Ashley Babbitt officer-involved shooting, that she was shot and killed on January 6th. I'm not saying that was an unlawful shooting. I'm not saying the police officer did anything wrong. I'm not saying that his actions were unlawful. I'm not saying that he violated policy. I'm not even going to say that he violated training. What I'm asking for is that we apply the Babbitt standard for all police officer-involved shootings. And what I mean by that is Ashley Babbitt was an unarmed, 120-pound female. She was not actively attacking anyone, but she was criminally trespassing. She was shot in the neck and killed by a police officer. There were no protests, there were no riots, there were no lawsuits, no charges for the police officers, and no questions. There was blind trust in police to investigate themselves. So I just think we need to apply that standard everywhere to every single officer-involved shooting. That's my stance on the Ashley Babbitt case. Curious what other people think about that. All right, so those are the cases that I wanted to go through this week. I really appreciate everybody participating and in here with the comments. If anybody else has any other interesting topics or shows, maybe there's a case. So the Utah case, that's an example. This is the first one we covered. That's something I didn't really even realize until someone sent me a message about it, asking me to look at it. So I have been looking at that the last couple days. But definitely a lot of the things that we cover here on this show are things that the viewers put into the chat. So even after the live feed is over, if you comment on it, that is something I check during the week. So thank you again for being here. Appreciate your participation. Please go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And you can also go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News, just about everywhere. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks.